Testing as a philosophy. How do sort of modern software companies think about testing? Sort of in the old days, I'm going to say that there was a focus really on debugging. Developers would write some code and they would sort of, they would poke at it. They would sort of do what they would call testing. Maybe it meant just manually exercising the code. But then there would be a separate team, sometimes called software quality assurance, and they would be the ones responsible for doing the real testing. They would report bugs back to the developers who would fix the bugs, toss it back over the wall, and so forth. The way that the QA staff would do their testing varied, but it was not unusual for it to be manual. In an app that was user-facing, they would try a bunch of things the user would do, and they would look for places where the app didn't behave as expected. And it would be sort of their job to think about all the corner cases and test the tricky flows and try to make the app misbehave and stuff like that. Today, testing is more focused on maintainability and validation. Remember, validation is the right thing being built. So testing is now part of the agile iteration, and it's really on the developers to do most of their own testing. And the tools that they use to do that, the processes for testing, have become much more automated. So developers really are more responsible. They're much closer to their own code. There usually is still a QA group or a software testing group, but more commonly, instead of that group being focused on doing testing, they're focused on creating tools and processes to improve testing for everyone. I remember, when I was young and dinosaurs ruled the earth and I was interviewing for software jobs, Microsoft was one of the places that I interviewed, and they bragged at the time that they had a ratio of one software test engineer for every software developer. They had as many testers as they had developers. And many years later, I was having a conversation with someone at Google, and this idea came up, and they said, we probably have one test engineer for every 10 or 20 developers. I don't know what the ratio is today. But the reason is that the test engineer's job is not to write tests for developers. They do that themselves. Their job is to create tools to make it possible to test code within this really complicated Google infrastructure. So there is still often some manual testing. There are, like having actual users try your app and do things that you wouldn't think of. There is still value in doing that. But the bulk of the responsibility for testing now falls on the developers. And because we've not got enough acronyms yet, here's one more. And a way of thinking about the philosophy of what makes a good test is the acronym FIRST, for fast, independent, repeatable, self-checking, and timely. So let us unpack what those mean. Okay, fast means fast. You're going to be running tests all the time. In fact, one of my favorite tools is this gem that sort of lurks in the background, and every time you save a new version of a file, it makes some guesses about which tests could be affected, and it automatically runs them in the background. And if something broke, you know it immediately. You get like a little pop-up notification. So you want tests to be able to run fast because you'll be running them all the time as you develop. Independent is actually kind of tricky. It means that no test depends on the results of any other tests. So in principle, you can run them in any order. And this is actually pretty important. In fact, the test frameworks, certainly the ones that we'll use, but a lot of modern ones, explicitly have an option that says randomize the order in which tests are run, because that will let you flush out cases where, for whatever reason, a particular test behaves one way, but depending on when it's run, which other tests come before it, it might behave differently, right? That's usually bad. Repeatable means what it says. If you run the test n times, you get the same result. Because if not, it's really hard to isolate a bug. Repeatable can actually be quite tricky because sometimes the test that you're running is testing a behavior that is time dependent. For example, the test does something to exercise the software, and it might take a variable range of time for the software to respond and do the thing that you're looking for. And in those cases, we get what are called fluttering tests, where sometimes they pass, sometimes they fail, and it's not clear what the difference is, right? Those can be very, very trying. But in general, you want it to be the case that you can rely, if the test fails, something's really wrong. And if the test passed, whatever it's testing can be counted on to really be solid. Self-checking means that the test can automatically detect if things went well. So there's no human being looking at the output saying, oh yeah, that looks like what it's supposed to do, right? Now, we've already seen a little bit of how to do this using Cucumber, where you can write scenarios in which Capybara looks at various elements on the page. Obviously, sometimes this is trickier than others because, for example, if you're looking for something to overlap in a certain way on the page, or if you're looking for an animation to look a certain way, some of those things are sometimes better left to manual testing. But for the most part, Tests should be able to determine by looking at the state of the world if the behavior being tested is working or not. And timely just means that you're writing them at about the same time as the code. And like I said, with TDD, the recommendation is you actually write the test first and then you backfill the code after that. In terms of tests being repeatable and independent, what kind of code could be tested repeatably and independently? For example, if code relies on randomness, like a game that plays cards and shuffles the deck before the game. Well, there's a number of strategies you could take. One of them is you could seed the random number generator with a known value. But more likely, and we're going to show some examples of this today, you can essentially fake the behavior of some of the things the app relies on in order to control it better. So for example, the random number generator, if you don't use the real one, you could use one that actually returns a known sequence of cards, and you could base your test on that. Similarly, for things where you're testing code that relies on the time of day, so something that should happen every Sunday at midnight. I mentioned briefly when we talked about Cucumber and Capybara, a library called TimeCop that essentially lets you stub the system clock and have the app sort of believe that it's whatever time you say it is. So there's a lot of external conditions about the world that you can manipulate in order to get repeatable and independent. And it's sort of a good exercise to think about those because it really exposes what parts of the app are in fact dependent on these external conditions and whether you can isolate those parts of the app well enough because it helps for testing, but then it also helps for maintenance because all of that variability, the knowledge about that is collected in one place.